Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today, we have a story that will leave you questioning everything about trust, betrayal, and revenge. This was shared by a Reddit user who found themselves at the crossroads of love and devastation. Imagine discovering your partner has been hiding a life you never knew existed, and then, instead of confronting them right away, you decide to let them think they've gotten away with it. But when the truth finally comes out, it's more shocking than anyone could have predicted. The story we're about to dive into isn't just about cheating, it's about the ultimate price of betrayal and the cold, calculated steps someone takes to reclaim control when they've been shattered. Get ready for a wild ride of twists, turns, and a final act that no one saw coming. Let's jump right in. Ethan had always been a patient man. He was the type who listened more than he spoke, who observed the little details that often went unnoticed by others. To most people, this trait seemed like a quiet strength, a calm that let him handle any situation with composure. But, as Ethan would soon come to realize, patience could also be a slow-burning fuse. He and Leela had been together for almost a decade, building what Ethan thought was a happy life. They had a cozy home, a small circle of close friends, and they shared a routine that felt stable and comfortable. Their lives were woven together in a way that seemed unbreakable, until Ethan began to notice subtle changes in Leela's behavior. At first, they were things he brushed off as paranoia: the odd texts she hid quickly, the phone calls she took in the other room, the increasing number of late nights at work. But once he had started noticing, he couldn't unsee it. The patterns grew clearer, the inconsistencies sharper. One evening, as Leela sat across from him at dinner, scrolling through her phone, Ethan felt his heart pound in a strange rhythm. He asked her how work was going, watching as her eyes darted up, wide and uneasy. She forced a smile, but he saw through it. She had no idea he knew. Not yet. Ethan decided to wait. He knew that accusations without proof would only lead to deflection, and he wanted to be sure. For weeks, he gathered evidence in silence. He checked her phone when she was in the shower, discovered hotel receipts tucked away in her purse, and one night he followed her. The restaurant she went to was quiet, intimate, and dimly lit. He watched from a distance as she sat with a man he recognized from her workplace. The way they laughed, the way she leaned in close to him, touching his arm casually, it was unmistakable. That night, Ethan lay awake beside her, his mind racing with thoughts of betrayal and hurt. But amid the chaos of emotions, something inside him shifted. He realized he wasn't just angry, he was cold. Detached. He felt the ache of betrayal, but it didn't consume him. Instead, it filled him with a calm resolve. He knew what he had to do. He would let her think she was safe, let her believe her secret was still intact. But he would plan his own revenge, a silent, calculated response that she wouldn't see coming. The days passed, and Ethan treated her as if nothing had changed. He was more affectionate, even attentive, while he crafted a plan to reveal her betrayal. He started leaving notes for her, subtle little reminders of memories they'd shared, favorite songs that had once been theirs, and moments that she had sworn were irreplaceable. He wanted her to feel that security, to remember what she had before he shattered it all. And Leela, unaware of Ethan's knowledge, became bolder. She grew careless, coming home later and slipping back into bed as if she'd only been out with friends. She never noticed the way he watched her, the way his eyes followed every movement, calculating and unblinking. Finally, the day came when he knew he was ready. Ethan had planned everything down to the last detail, each moment building to a conclusion that would leave no room for excuses. That evening, he invited a few of their closest friends over for dinner. Leela seemed pleased, a little surprised even, as if the gathering were a sweet gesture he'd organized just to make her happy. Throughout the evening, he noticed how at ease she seemed. She laughed easily, joked with their friends, and even leaned against him as though she were blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to break. At dinner, Ethan poured the wine and began talking about memories, asking each friend to share a favorite moment they'd experienced as a group. The stories flowed, laughter filled the room, and it all seemed so lighthearted, so normal. Then, Ethan pulled out his phone. He started playing a slideshow of their past trips together, each picture a carefully chosen reminder of their life as a couple. Leela's smile faded slowly as the images became more intimate, more pointed. Ethan could see her discomfort growing, her laughter now a fragile thing. And just when he sensed she was teetering on the edge, he stopped the slideshow. "I wanted to do something different tonight," he said, his tone calm and pleasant. He looked at her directly, holding her gaze with a piercing intensity. "I wanted to remind us all of how important honesty is in any relationship. And sometimes, it's only when we've experienced betrayal that we truly understand the value of trust." There was silence at the table, a cold tension that made Leela shift uncomfortably in her seat. But Ethan didn't let her look away. Instead, He reached into his pocket and pulled out the final piece of evidence, a printed stack of messages, photos, and receipts. He laid it on the table in front of her, his gaze unwavering. The color drained from her face as she realized what was happening. She stammered, trying to form words, but the room had fallen into an eerie silence, everyone's eyes on her as they absorbed the truth. She looked around helplessly, her face a mix of shame and fear, but Ethan didn't give her a chance to explain. Calmly, he said, "I thought it was time everyone knew." He let the silence hang, watching as the weight of her actions began to sink in. Leela's expression crumbled, and she looked down, unable to meet anyone's gaze. Ethan took a deep breath, feeling a strange satisfaction in seeing the realization hit her, knowing that her deception had finally been laid bare. But as he watched her, a small, nagging question crept into his mind he hadn't anticipated. This wasn't quite the satisfaction he had imagined. Seeing her fall apart, seeing the hollow shame in her eyes, it didn't erase the pain he had felt. It didn't undo the betrayal. And so, Ethan left. He stood up, his expression unreadable, and left the room without another word, the quiet aftermath of his revelation lingering behind him. But in the days that followed, he found that his own pain had only deepened. He had revealed everything, exposed her lies, and watched her crumble, yet there was no closure. Instead, he was haunted by thoughts of what came next. Could he forgive her? Could they rebuild? Or had he just opened a wound that could never truly heal? Leela reached out to him, pleading for forgiveness, trying to explain herself, but Ethan remained distant, unsure of what he wanted, unsure if there could ever be a future after what she had done. As he wrestled with his own feelings, he realized that his story was far from over. This was only the beginning of something deeper, a search for answers, a search for meaning in the aftermath of betrayal. Ethan didn't know what to do with himself in the days that followed. The house, once a comforting place filled with the sound of Leela's laughter, now felt cold and silent. It seemed as though everything had shifted in an instant, like the world had tilted and nothing would ever be quite the same again. He didn't know what he was looking for: closure, peace, maybe even some twisted form of justice, but no matter what he thought, the feeling of betrayal continued to eat at him, gnawing away at his insides. Leela, on the other hand, was relentless. She called, sent text messages, and even showed up at his office, waiting for him after work with tear-streaked eyes and an apology on the tip of her tongue. Every word from her felt like a desperate plea, a woman trying to salvage whatever she could from the wreckage of her own making. And yet, with each attempt, Ethan found himself growing more detached, more certain that this wasn't something that could simply be fixed with words. But there was one moment, one brief flicker of hesitation that haunted him. It was during a phone call, a week after the dinner party, when Leela had sounded so different. Her voice wasn't desperate anymore, it was quiet, resigned, almost as if she had already begun to accept the consequences of her actions. "I don't know why I did it," she had said softly, her voice cracking. "I wish I could take it all back. I never meant for this to happen. But don't just throw me away. I made a mistake. A huge mistake. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I need you to understand that I didn't mean to hurt you." Her words stayed with him longer than he liked to admit. It was almost as if he could hear her truly regretting it. But regret wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. Ethan couldn't simply ignore everything he had discovered, couldn't pretend that the months of lies and secrets hadn't occurred. Trust was like glass. Once it was shattered, no matter how hard you try, it could never be fully repaired. The silence that filled their home was deafening. The space that had once been shared, with their laughter and conversations filling every room, now felt like a void, an empty space that had no place for either of them anymore. Leela seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once, always hovering on the edge of his awareness, her presence a constant reminder of everything he had lost. It felt like he was slowly suffocating under the weight of it all. Days turned into weeks, and Ethan found himself in a strange kind of limbo. He wasn't sure what he wanted anymore, whether he wanted her back, whether he wanted revenge, or whether he simply wanted to escape the painful reminder of everything they had built together, and everything she had destroyed. The emotional toll it took on him was far more consuming than he'd imagined. It wasn't just about the affair, it was about the years of trust he had given her, about how he had invested so much of himself into someone who, it turned out, had never truly been his. He began to see everything differently. The moments they shared that once felt so meaningful, the inside jokes, the stolen glances, now all seemed tainted, as though they were nothing more than fleeting distractions in the wake of the truth. Ethan had always thought he could read people well. After all, he'd spent so many years carefully observing, listening, watching. But Leela's deceit had slipped through his radar, had woven itself into the fabric of their life until it was too late. She was never the person he thought she was. And so, Ethan made a decision. He needed to take control of the situation to reclaim his life in a way that made sense to him. He realized that, in a strange way, this was his moment to finally gain the power he had always believed he had lost. The power of choice, the ability to move forward on his own terms. But it wouldn't be easy. There was still so much to untangle, so many emotions to deal with, so many questions unanswered. One evening, he sat in the quiet of their living room, the light of the setting sun casting long shadows across the floor. He could feel the weight of the past pressing against him, but he was resolute. He wasn't going to let Leela off easy. Not this time. Ethan decided that he would confront her once more, but this time, it would be different. He would expose her, not out of rage or a desire for revenge, but because he needed to understand the full extent of her betrayal. He needed to know how far she had fallen, how deep her lies ran. He had always believed that if people were honest, if they were vulnerable, they could rebuild from anything. But he no longer believed in second chances, not with her. One evening, after work, Ethan returned home to find the house eerily quiet. Leela was sitting in the living room, her posture stiff and anxious, as if she were waiting for him to speak. The moment he entered the room, she stood up quickly, as if to greet him, but he didn't move. His eyes locked onto hers, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. It was a moment that stretched on, heavy with the weight of everything that had transpired. Finally, Ethan broke the silence. "I need to know everything, Leela," he said, his voice low and controlled. "I need to know the truth. All of it." Her eyes shifted nervously. She opened her mouth to speak, but then hesitated, as if unsure of how to proceed. Ethan could see the internal struggle, the weight of guilt that seemed to hang over her. "Please," he urged, "tell me everything." She took a deep breath, and for the first time since this whole ordeal had begun, she seemed genuinely vulnerable. "It wasn't just one affair," she confessed, her voice barely a whisper. "It wasn't just with him. There were others. Before him. I didn't know what I was doing. I was lost, and I thought I could keep it all from you. I thought if I could keep it hidden, if I could keep you in the dark, I could live with it. But I was wrong. I hurt you. I've hurt you so much." Ethan stood there in silence, processing what she was saying. The realization hit him with full force. This was no longer just about a single betrayal. It was a series of lies that stretched back further than he could have ever imagined. His heart twisted, not with the familiar pain of betrayal, but with the crushing weight of the years that had been wasted off the love he had given to someone who had never truly valued it. "And now?" he asked, his voice steady, though his insides felt like they were being torn apart. "What happens now, Leela?" She looked at him, her eyes full of regret. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect anything from you anymore. But please, don't leave me without telling me what to do. I can't lose you, Ethan. I know I've already lost your trust, but please, let me fix this." Ethan felt the finality of her words hit him, and for a moment he felt the urge to comfort her, to tell her that it wasn't too late, that they could work through this. But then the reality of it all crashed back into his mind, and he realized that there was no going back. The truth had come to light, and nothing would ever be the same again. "I don't know what comes next, Leela," he said quietly, "but I do know one thing. We can never go back to what we were." And with that, Ethan left, walking away from the wreckage of a life that no longer felt like his. The questions of whether he could ever forgive her, whether they could ever rebuild their relationship, remained unanswered. But for the first time in weeks, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: clarity. As he stepped out into the night, Ethan understood that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a much darker journey, one that would force him to face not only the woman who had betrayed him, but the truth about himself and what he was truly capable of. And in the end, he would decide whether he was strong enough to walk away or if he was willing to fight for a future that, for now, seemed impossibly distant. Ethan's mind raced as he stepped away from Leela, each step echoing like the beat of his own heart. The cold night air bit at his skin, but he hardly noticed. His thoughts were consumed by the conversation they had just had, the revelation that had shattered what little remained of his belief in their relationship. As he walked away from the house, the weight of the truth seemed to press down on him with every step. It wasn't just Leela's betrayal that had broken him, it was the realization that he had been living in a world of delusion, believing that the life they had built together was real, when in fact, it had been built on lies and half-truths. As the hours passed, Ethan found himself at a crossroads, caught between the desire to turn around and fix things and the overwhelming urge to keep walking, to walk far away and never look back. His mind spun with conflicting emotions: rage, hurt, confusion, but underneath it all, there was something more unsettling. A creeping sense of calm that seemed to take over, as though the storm inside him had quieted. In that silence, something new began to take shape, something darker, more profound, and far more dangerous than he had anticipated. He didn't know where he was going or even why he was walking, but the movement gave him some sense of control. He found himself in the old part of the city where the streets were narrow and winding, and the buildings loomed high above, their faces cracked and weathered with time. This area, once full of life, now felt like a forgotten relic, just like him. As he wandered aimlessly, the reality of what had just happened began to set in. Leela had confessed, and in doing so had torn the last shred of trust from their relationship. And yet, what he felt was not the anger or sorrow he had expected. No, what he felt was a gnawing emptiness, a hollow place inside him that only seemed to grow larger the more he thought about it. The questions began to swirl. How could she do this to him? Why had she lied for so long? Why had she betrayed the love they had shared? But there were no answers that could satisfy him, no explanation that could undo the damage. The truth was simple. She had chosen to betray him. And now, in the quiet aftermath, Ethan was left to pick up the pieces of his life. It wasn't long before he realized he wasn't alone. A figure had appeared in his peripheral vision, walking beside him at a slow, steady pace. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark coat. Ethan didn't recognize him, but there was something about the man that seemed familiar, as if their paths had crossed before, but in a way that felt distant, almost like a memory half-remembered. The man didn't speak at first, just walked silently beside Ethan, keeping pace with his slow, disjointed steps. After a few moments, the man finally spoke. "You're not the first to walk this path," he said in a low, gravelly voice. Ethan turned to look at him, but the man's face was shadowed by the brim of his hat, obscured in the dim light of the street. For a moment, Ethan wasn't sure if he was being followed or if the man had simply been walking the same route, but there was something in the way he spoke, in the cadence of his voice, that made Ethan pause. "What do you mean?" Ethan asked, his voice almost inaudible, as if the question itself held more weight than he was ready to confront. The man chuckled, the sound low and almost mocking. "People like you," he said, "the ones who think they've been betrayed, the ones who believe they've been wronged, they all end up here, walking the same road, feeling the same emptiness inside, and most of them never find their way out." Ethan narrowed his eyes. "Who are you?" he asked, a touch of unease creeping into his voice. "Someone who's seen it all," the man replied cryptically. "I've watched countless people stumble through life, lost in their own bitterness and rage, all because they never faced the truth. And you're no different. You're standing on the edge of something, Ethan. But you need to decide, will you let her win, or will you take control of this narrative?" Ethan's heart skipped a beat. His instinct was to walk away from the stranger, to dismiss him as nothing more than a madman in the streets, but something about the man's words struck a chord deep within him. He had always prided himself on his ability to control situations, to think before acting, but now, as he stood here, everything felt uncertain, the ground beneath him shifting with every passing moment. The man continued, his voice low and deliberate. "You've been given a choice, whether you realize it or not. She's already shown you who she really is. And now, the question is, what are you going to do about it? You can let her walk away with everything, or you can take back what's yours." Ethan stopped in his tracks, the weight of the man's words crashing into him. A part of him wanted to tell the stranger to leave him alone, to walk away and forget this bizarre encounter. But another part, a darker part, was listening intently, as if the man was speaking directly to that part of him that had been quietly festering ever since he had discovered the truth about Leela. "And if I take control?" Ethan asked, his voice laced with skepticism, but also a growing curiosity. The man's lips curled into a thin, knowing smile. "Then you'll see how far you're willing to go to reclaim what's yours. You see, revenge isn't just about punishment. It's about reclaiming your power, your dignity. It's about showing her that you're not someone to be played with." Ethan felt a shiver run down his spine. The words echoed in his mind, twisting, turning, filling him with a strange, almost electric sense of possibility. The idea of revenge, of taking control, of turning the tables on Leela, was something he hadn't allowed himself to entertain until now. The anger and hurt he had buried deep inside suddenly began to burn brighter, hotter, like a fire being stoked. "You don't have to make a decision right now," the man continued, his voice calm and measured. "But you should know this, once you start down this path, there's no turning back. The lines will blur. You won't know who you're becoming until it's too late." Ethan stood there for a long moment, his mind racing, a storm of emotions swirling inside him. The stranger's words were like a pull, dragging him into an abyss of uncertainty and temptation. He had been wronged. He had been betrayed. And now, there was a part of him that wanted to make Leela pay, to make her feel the way he had felt in those early days, the hollow ache that threatened to swallow him whole. "Thank you," Ethan said quietly, his voice steady now. "I'll think about what you said." The man nodded and then, without another word, turned and disappeared into the night, leaving Ethan alone in the street, his thoughts a tangled mess. But one thing was certain: it couldn't go back. The quiet rage inside him had been awakened, and he knew that, for better or worse, he was going to find a way to make Leela understand the cost of betrayal. And so, as the days passed, Ethan began to plan. He watched, he listened, he learned the patterns of her life, places she went, the people she saw. He took note of every detail, every movement, as though he were preparing for a battle. It wasn't just about punishing her anymore. It was about showing her, and himself, that he could take back control, that he could emerge from the ashes of his shattered life stronger than ever. But as he began to set his plan into motion, Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing something intangible but important. The line between justice and revenge was blurring, and the deeper he went, the more he wondered if there would be anything left of him when it was all over. Would he be the same man who had loved Leela once? Or would the darkness that was slowly consuming him take everything, leaving only a shell of who he had been? He didn't know the answer, but one thing was certain: it was no longer the man who had walked into that dinner, trusting the woman he loved. And now, there was no turning back. Ethan's descent into the murky waters of revenge began to feel like a slow unraveling, a process that he couldn't stop, even if he wanted to. The more he thought about Leela, the more he saw her for what she really was: a person who had betrayed his trust, his love, his entire world. He couldn't stop the images of her with other men, the lies she told, the moments of happiness that now felt tainted. Every thought seemed to wind tighter and tighter around him, the bitterness growing like a vine that would not be pruned. And the more he stewed in it, the more he realized that if he didn't do something, if he didn't take control, might never feel free again. It started small, like a quiet echo in the back of his mind. At first, he didn't act on his anger, but simply observed. He paid attention to her movements when she left the house, when she came back, the time she spent on the phone, the strange way she acted when she thought he wasn't watching. It was unsettling, this constant surveillance, but it gave him something. It gave him a purpose. He knew that the moment would come, when the full truth would come out, when everything he had learned would be used as a weapon. Leela had no idea. She continued as if everything were normal, thinking that her confessions had been enough, that she could still salvage what remained of their marriage. She had apologized countless times, throwing herself at his feet, begging for his forgiveness. But Ethan's heart had hardened, and with each apology, he only grew colder. Her sincerity, if it even existed, didn't matter anymore. He had seen her for what she truly was, a woman who had betrayed him, and nothing would undo that. As the weeks went by, Ethan's mind grew darker, more consumed by the need for retribution. Every conversation with Leela, every glimpse of her sad eyes, only fueled the fire. He began to imagine scenarios, complex webs of schemes, each one more intricate than the last. He couldn't bring himself to confront her outright. That would be too easy, too direct. No, he wanted something more. He wanted her to feel the weight of what she had done, to understand the full extent of the damage she had caused. One evening, after yet another tense dinner, where Leela had tried and failed to make small talk, Ethan's patience finally snapped. He watched her carefully, noting how she nervously toyed with her fork, avoiding his gaze. He could see the guilt in her eyes, but it wasn't enough anymore. It wasn't enough to erase the betrayal. She didn't understand the depth of the hurt she had caused him. "You don't get it, do you?" he said, his voice barely above a whisper, but cold and deliberate. Leela looked up, startled by the change in his tone. She opened her mouth to speak, but Ethan raised his hand, stopping her. "You think apologies will fix this?" he continued, his words like sharp knives. "You think that by saying I'm sorry, everything will just go back to normal? I've been watching you, Leela. I know everything." The words hung heavy in the air, and Leela's face drained of color. She opened her mouth to protest, but Ethan didn't give her a chance. He had planned this moment, rehearsed it over and over in his mind, and now, as the truth spilled from his lips, it felt almost too easy. "I know about the man from your work," he said, his voice growing steadier. "The one you've been seeing behind my back. And I know it wasn't just him. There were others, weren't there?" Her face went pale, and for the first time in a long while, Ethan saw her panic. The look in her eyes shifted from the defensive, rehearsed sorrow she had shown him for weeks to something more primal. She wasn't just sorry anymore. She was afraid. "Ethan, please," she stammered, her hands trembling. "I never meant for you to find out. I thought I could fix everything. I thought I could keep it hidden. But I didn't want this. I didn't want to hurt you." "You didn't want to hurt me?" Ethan said, laughing bitterly. "You've been hurting me for months, Leela. And now you want me to believe you?" Leela fell silent, her eyes pleading. But Ethan wasn't done. This wasn't about forgiveness. This wasn't about reconciliation. This was about showing her what it meant to break someone's heart and think they could just move on from it. "You've had your chances," he said, his tone final, "and you've thrown them all away. I've been patient, Leela. I've been patient because I thought we could work through this, but I see now that I've been nothing more than a fool." Ethan stood up, pacing the room, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what he wanted, but he knew that he needed to make her see. He needed her to understand that she had pushed him too far, that the damage was irreversible. The rage that had simmered beneath the surface finally broke free, and he was no longer able to hold it in. "Do you really think you can just apologize your way out of this?" Ethan spat, turning to face her. "Do you think I'm just going to forgive you because you cry and beg? It doesn't work like that." Leela's eyes were wide, but now she didn't speak. She couldn't. Ethan knew she had nothing left to say. And in that moment, the truth settled in. There was no redemption for her. She had burned that bridge the moment she had betrayed him. Ethan had no intention of forgiving her, not now, not ever. But there was something deeper inside him now. A cold, bitter part of him that wanted more than just to walk away. He wanted her to feel the weight of her choices, to understand that some actions could never be undone. Ethan's thoughts turned to the man who had spoken to him that night, the stranger who had opened his eyes to a new possibility. Revenge was not just about punishment, it was about reclaiming power. He wasn't going to let Leela have the upper hand. He wasn't going to let her think she could simply walk away from the wreckage she had caused. No, this wasn't over. Not by a long shot. "I'm not done with you yet, Leela," he said quietly, his voice devoid of emotion. "You'll see. You'll understand what it feels like to be the one betrayed." Leela's face fell, and she took a step back, as though she were afraid of him. Ethan could see the fear in her eyes, and for a moment, it felt almost satisfying. But as the darkness inside him grew, he knew that this was just the beginning. The path he was walking was not one that could be easily reversed. Once he had gone down this road, there was no turning back. The days that followed were a blur of calculations, a plan set into motion. Ethan didn't rush it. He didn't need to. The longer Leela thought she was safe, the better. She had no idea what was coming. And every day, Ethan found himself slipping further into a version of himself he didn't quite recognize. The man who had once been gentle, trusting, and kind was now driven by something darker, something that didn't care about love or forgiveness. It was all about power now. And soon, Leela would know what it felt like to be completely powerless. But even as he reveled in the thought of what was to come, a small voice inside him he hadn't listened to in a long time whispered that there was a cost to revenge. That even in the pursuit of justice there was a price to pay. Ethan ignored it. He couldn't afford to listen to that voice now. He had already made his choice.